I was just trying to save a patient's life, but when I defied my hospital's orders, I accidentally pulled a thread that threatened to dismantle a massive organized scheme. Now, I'm holding a drive that could topple the city's entire power structure, and the people responsible are willing to burn everything to the ground to keep me silent. I have always believed that medicine is a calling, not just a career, but apparently, at St. Jude's Metropolitan, it is a business strategy, and my lack of compliance just cost me everything. It started on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the hospital corridors hum with that particular mix of antiseptic and misery. I was working the late shift in the ER when they brought him in, a man in his late 60s, shivering, clutching his chest. He wasn't a regular patient. He was someone who had clearly been sleeping rough for weeks, his clothes damp, his eyes glazed with pain. My supervisor, a man named Henderson, whose only interest in biology was how much he could bill for it, cornered me before I could even get the man to a triage bed. "Don't bother with the paperwork, Miller," he hissed, his voice echoing off the sterile tiles. "He doesn't have insurance, and he doesn't have a contact number. We aren't a charity. Send him to the city clinic across town. They're equipped for the unfunded, as we call them." I looked at the man, who was gasping for air, and then back at Henderson. The directive was clear, but my conscience wouldn't allow it. I knew that the city clinic was a 3-hour bus ride away, and this man wouldn't survive the journey. I defied him. I pulled the patient into the trauma bay, hooked him up to the monitors, and started the stabilizing protocols. Henderson's face went white with rage. He didn't just yell, he made a phone call, and within 20 minutes, I was being escorted out of the building by security. My badge was deactivated, my locker was cleared, and I was handed a termination letter that cited gross insubordination and endangering institutional financial integrity. As I walked out into the downpour, my phone already buzzing with notification after notification of my severance, or lack thereof, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had saved a life, and if the price was my job, I'd pay it 10 times over. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the freezing rain soak through my scrubs. My car was in the back lot, but I didn't even care to retrieve it. I just wanted to leave this place behind. Then, the silence of the city night was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tires on wet pavement. It wasn't the sound of an ambulance, and it certainly wasn't a patrol car. A massive black motorcade, comprised of sleek, armored SUVs with darkened windows, pulled into the circular driveway of the hospital. They didn't slow down. They surged forward, cutting off the ER entrance with military precision. My heart skipped a beat as the lead vehicle stopped inches from where I was standing. A man in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He didn't look at the building. He looked directly at me. I stepped back, my boots splashing into a puddle, my mind racing. Who on earth was important enough to command this kind of presence at a mediocre hospital like St. Jude's? The man adjusted his cuffs and gestured toward me. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice cold and devoid of warmth, "you have no idea what you've just done, do you? You didn't just save a patient, you just intercepted an investigation." I blinked, confused, my hands trembling slightly. "I'm a doctor. I provide care. I don't know what you're talking about." The man sighed, a sound that held more malice than pity. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a digital tablet, flicking the screen toward me. It showed my patient, the man I had just stabilized, in a dossier labeled with a bright red seal. That patient is the key witness in a massive, systemic, organized scheme that has been rotting this city from the inside out. By keeping him here, by creating a paper trail of his medical records, you've put a target on your own back that the entire city's power structure wants to erase. Before I could process the words, the rear door of the third SUV opened. A woman with an earpiece stepped out, holding a folder that looked like it contained a lifetime of secrets. She walked toward the entrance, but as she passed me, she leaned in close. The smell of rain and expensive cologne was overwhelming. "You're not going home tonight, doctor," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the hospital's loading dock, where I saw a flash of light, the unmistakable glint of a scope. "In fact, you might not ever be going home again, because we've been tracking this group for months, and now that you've touched the patient, you're officially part of the record they need to destroy." Panic flared in my chest. I looked back at the hospital, realizing the security guards who had kicked me out weren't just following orders. They were looking at the motorcade with genuine, primal terror. The man in the suit reached back into his car and pulled out a heavy, tactical case. "Get in," he commanded, his voice shifting from cold to urgent. "If we leave now, we might make it to the safe zone. If we stay, the people behind this operation will ensure that both you and that man disappear before the sun rises." I looked at the dark, desolate street, then at the sprawling motorcade, and finally at the hospital lobby, where I saw the shadow of someone moving toward the entrance with a heavy object held low to their side. I knew then that my life as a doctor was over, and a nightmare I couldn't possibly understand had just begun. I didn't think. I moved. The instinct to survive surged through me, overriding the shock of the situation. I dove into the back seat of the lead SUV, the leather upholstery cold and smelling faintly of ozone and expensive machinery. As I slammed the door shut, the vehicle lurched forward, tires screeching against the rain-slicked asphalt. Through the rear window, I caught a glimpse of the hospital lobby. The glass doors shattered outward, showering the pavement in a spray of razor-sharp fragments. A group of men, dressed in nondescript black tactical gear, poured out of the shadows, and I saw the unmistakable profile of illegal weapons being leveled toward our departing convoy. "Keep your head down, doctor," the woman with the earpiece shouted from the front passenger seat. She didn't look back. Her eyes were locked on a screen displaying a thermal map of the city grid. "They've got spotters on the rooftops. If we hit the main intersection, we're sitting ducks." The man in the charcoal suit, who was driving with a terrifying, calculated calm, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We aren't taking the main road," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. He swerved violently, taking a sharp turn into an alleyway that looked far too narrow for a vehicle of this size. The screech of metal against brick set my teeth on edge, but we plowed through, sparks flying in the dim light. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice cracking under the adrenaline. "You talk about an organized scheme, you mention investigations, and then you show up with a motorcade like your government officials, but I've never seen any of you at the hospital before. Are you with the internal inspection team?" The man glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold as flint. "We are the cleanup crew, Miller. We're the ones who step in when the system fails to purge its own corruption. The internal inspection team is bought and paid for. If you had gone to them, you would have been dead by morning." The car hit a pothole, sending us airborne for a split second before slamming back onto the pavement. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I refused to look away from the tablet the woman was holding. I saw a live feed of the hospital ER where I had just been working. My patient, the man I had saved, was being wheeled out on a gurney, not by medical staff, but by the same men who had attacked the convoy. My blood ran cold. I had risked everything to save his life, and now he was being hauled away like a piece of cargo to be silenced. "They have him," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "They're going to kill him. We have to go back." The man at the wheel let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "Back? If we go back, we're walking into a slaughterhouse. That man isn't just a witness. He's the architect of the entire network. He didn't come to your ER for help. He came because he knew his own people were coming to take him out after he tried to defect. By saving him, you complicated the timeline, and now you've become the only person who knows where the encryption keys are hidden." My breath hitched. "Encryption keys? I don't know anything about keys. I just did my job." The woman turned around, her expression unreadable. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, tossing it into my lap. It was heavy, metallic, and warm to the touch. "He shoved this into your scrubs while you were stabilizing his lung, Miller. Don't tell me you didn't feel it. He trusted you with it because you were the only person in that building who didn't look at him like a paycheck. You are the only person who can unlock the contents of this drive, and the people behind this are willing to burn this entire city to the ground to get it back." Before I could demand more answers, a deafening explosion rocked the SUV. The vehicle swerved, fishtailing wildly before spinning out of control. We slammed into a stack of shipping crates, the airbags detonating with a sound like a gunshot. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and acrid. My ears were ringing, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a blur of gray and white. I felt strong hands grabbing my collar, hauling me out of the wreckage as the smell of burning rubber and gasoline flooded my senses. I stumbled to my feet, my vision swimming. We were in a desolate industrial yard, surrounded by warehouses. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement, dozens of them, closing in from all sides. I looked to my left and saw the woman drawing a sidearm, her posture rigid and ready for a fight. The man in the suit shoved me toward a rusted metal shipping container. "Hide!" he screamed, his voice raw. "Don't come out until you hear the signal. If they find you with that drive, you need to destroy it, or they will succeed in burying the truth forever." I scrambled into the dark, cramped space of the container, clutching the drive to my chest. I watched through a crack in the metal as the man and the woman stood back to back, facing the darkness of the yard. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their silhouettes illuminated by the distant city lights. There were at least 20 of them, all armed, all moving with the synchronized, predatory grace of a professional strike team. As the leader of the approaching group stepped into the light, I felt my heart stop completely. It was Henderson, my former boss, and he wasn't wearing his white coat anymore. He was holding an advanced tactical weapon, and his eyes were filled with a cold, hollow void. He looked directly at the shipping container, smiled, and raised his hand to signal his men. The world seemed to narrow down to the space between Henderson's eyes and the jagged gap in the metal wall where I crouched. He didn't look like the man who lectured me about hospital billing codes anymore. His movements were fluid, aggressive, and entirely devoid of the bureaucratic tedium he used to project. He wasn't just a supervisor, he was the primary contractor for a nightmare I hadn't even begun to fathom. As he raised his hand, the air in the industrial yard seemed to vibrate with a tension that was thick enough to choke on. "Find him," Henderson commanded, his voice carrying clearly over the patter of rain on the corrugated steel. "He doesn't have the stomach for a fight, and he definitely doesn't know how to use what he's carrying. Just make sure the drive is intact. The rest of him? That's disposable." The strike team fanned out, their movements precise and predatory. I pressed my back against the cold interior of the shipping container, my lungs burning as I forced myself to take shallow, silent breaths. I was trapped. To my left, a stack of wooden pallets offered a small sliver of cover. To my right, the container wall was dented and thin, likely unable to stop a determined bullet. My fingers tightened around the encrypted drive in my pocket. It felt like it was burning a hole through my fabric. What was on this thing? If Henderson was willing to turn an entire hospital district into a war zone for it, it had to be worth more than just money. It was leverage, the kind that could topple the city's entire political and financial structure. Outside, the man in the charcoal suit and the woman were locked in a desperate firefight. I heard the sharp, rhythmic crack of suppressed fire, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the gravel. It was a symphony of violence, and I was the conductor who had inadvertently started the music. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. If they breached this container, it would be over in seconds. I looked around the interior for anything, a tool, a pipe, anything, but the space was empty, save for a few discarded shipping manifests and a thick, oily film covering the floor. Suddenly, the firing stopped. A deafening, suffocating silence descended on the yard. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of retreating footsteps or the click of a safety being disengaged. Then, a voice spoke, not Henderson's, but a cold, synthesized tone that seemed to be amplified from somewhere above. "The device is not a weapon, Dr. Miller. It's an insurance policy. If you open it, you lock the data to your own biometric signature. You'll be the only person on Earth who can access it, but you'll also be the only person they will hunt." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Was there a hidden surveillance system in the container? I pulled the drive out and stared at it. It was a sleek, matte black piece of hardware with a small indentation on the side, a thumbprint scanner. The logic of the situation hit me with terrifying clarity. I was a doctor, a healer, someone who spent his life protecting biological functions. If I let this data die with me, I was failing in my duty. If I activated it, I was signing a death warrant that no witness protection program could ever nullify. The sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel, approaching the container door. Henderson was close. I could hear his rhythmic, measured breathing. He wasn't rushing, he was savoring the hunt. "I know you're in there, Miller," he called out, his voice smooth and taunting. "You think you're the hero of this story, don't you? The humble doctor standing up to the big, bad corporation. But look at what you've caused. How many people do you think will die tonight because you couldn't just follow a simple discharge order?" His hand touched the handle of the container door. It rattled, the metal screeching in protest. My hands trembled, but as he pulled, I made my choice. I pressed my thumb firmly against the scanner on the drive. A faint blue light flickered, then stabilized, illuminating the dark interior with a ghostly digital glow. The drive didn't just beep. It projected a holographic interface that filled the cramped container with a dense, spinning web of financial ledgers, GPS coordinates, and names. Henderson threw the door open, his weapon leveled at my chest. But he stopped dead, his eyes widening as he looked into the container. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the hologram. The light from the drive reflected in his pupils, dancing with a frantic, desperate intensity. "You fool," he breathed, his voice dropping to a tremor. "You have no idea who is watching that feed right now. You've just turned the key in a lock that the internal inspection team has been trying to break for a decade. And they aren't going to send a negotiator to get it back." As he stepped toward me, reaching for the drive, the sky above the industrial yard suddenly lit up with the blinding, focused beam of a spotlight from a hovering drone. A series of high-pitched whistles pierced the air, and before Henderson could pull the trigger, the entire container was rocked by a massive, precise impact from above. The world tilted, the metal groaned and buckled, and I felt myself being dragged downward as the floor of the container gave way, plunging me into a dark, subterranean void beneath the yard. As I plummeted into the blackness, I realized with a jolt of horror that I wasn't just being saved. I was being kidnapped by something far more sophisticated than Henderson's small-time operation. The fall felt like an eternity, a descent into a throat of concrete and shadow. I hit a pile of industrial packing materials with a bone-jarring thud, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp wheeze. The hologram from the drive flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the damp, subterranean walls. I was in a tunnel, a massive, vaulted storm drain, or perhaps a forgotten service conduit running deep beneath the city's foundation. The air here was heavy with the scent of stagnant water and old electricity. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. My phone was dead, shattered in the fall, but the drive, the mysterious glowing key, was still clutched in my hand. Its blue light was pulse rhythm, like a heartbeat. Above me, I could hear the muffled, frantic shouting of Henderson's men, their voices echoing down the ventilation shaft like demons in a canyon. They were scrambling to find a way down, their heavy boots clanking against the metal grate that had given way under the impact. I didn't wait to see if they'd find a ladder. I turned and ran, my footsteps splashing through the shallow, freezing sludge of the drainage tunnel. The walls were lined with heavy industrial cables and fiber optic bundles, vibrating with a high-pitched hum that set my teeth on edge. This wasn't just city infrastructure. This was the nervous system of an organized scheme so vast it had its own private tunnels. I followed the cables, guided by the flickering light of the drive, which seemed to be recalibrating. Every time I passed a junction box, the drive would emit a soft chime, as if it were mapping the facility's architecture in real time. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a massive, cavernous chamber. It looked like an abandoned subway station, but it had been retrofitted with state-of-the-art server racks and surveillance monitors. It was a command center, the nerve center of the entire operation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the scale of what I had stumbled into. Thousands of data points scrolled across wall-to-wall screens. Bank transfers, medical history modifications, influence peddling, and logs of disappeared patients. The drive in my hand was the master password for the entire grid. I stood there, paralyzed, the glowing light of the drive illuminating my wide-eyed reflection in the darkened glass of a monitor. Then, I heard it. The soft, rhythmic clicking of heels on concrete. Not the heavy, aggressive stomp of a tactical team, but the precise, elegant pace of someone who belonged here. I ducked behind a stack of crates, holding my breath, my skin crawling. "You're a long way from the ER, Dr. Miller," a voice echoed through the vast, hollow chamber. It was a woman's voice, composed, educated, and chillingly familiar. I peeked around the corner. Standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the glow of 100 monitors, was the head of administration from St. Jude's, the woman who had personally signed my termination papers. She wasn't just a hospital executive, she was dressed in a tactical suit that looked like it was pulled from a high-budget sci-fi thriller. Beside her stood two men in sterile white uniforms, but their eyes were cold, professional, and undeniably dangerous. "You were always such an observant doctor," she continued, strolling toward a console. "You were the only one who noticed the discrepancies in the billing cycles. You were the only one who started asking questions about why our unfunded patients never left the facility. It's a shame, really. You had a bright career ahead of you." I gripped the drive, my knuckles white. "What is this place?" I whispered, though I already knew. She stopped, turning to face the crates where I was hiding. She didn't look angry, she looked pitying. "This is the engine, doctor. The city isn't run by politicians or bankers. It's run by the data. And the data requires fresh, untraceable human samples to test our experimental protocols. Your patient wasn't a witness. He was a product. And by trying to save him, you didn't just break the rules. You accidentally downloaded the master list of every soul this facility has ever traded." She signaled the two men, who began to slowly encircle the crates. There was nowhere to run. I felt the drive in my hand shudder, and then a voice began to play through the speakers of the room. Not a digital voice, but my own voice, recorded from the hospital room when I first treated the patient. "I'm a doctor. I provide care. I don't know what you're talking about." "The drive is syncing with our system," the administrator noted, checking her watch. "In exactly 60 seconds, it will purge all the evidence of our work. It will burn the servers, it will wipe the files, and it will leave you standing here with nothing but an empty piece of plastic and a very short future." I looked at the drive, then at the console she was approaching. I had a choice. Let the data vanish and hope they'd let me walk away, or initiate the failsafe I saw buried in the drive's submenu, a command that would not only destroy the data, but would broadcast the entire location and encrypted history to the global network, including the internal safety authorities. It would destroy everything, but it would also bury me under the rubble of this underground bunker. As the countdown hit 30 seconds, I saw a shadow move behind the administrator, someone who hadn't been there before. It was the woman with the earpiece from the motorcade, her weapon raised, but her face was pale, looking at the ceiling. "It's not just us, ma'am," she hissed, her voice trembling. "The internal inspection team didn't send a squad, they sent a suppression team, and they've already locked the blast doors from the outside." The room began to vibrate. The ceiling started to crack, and a deep, mechanical grinding sound echoed through the chamber. The blast doors were sealing, and the entire structure was being prepared for a total, lethal sanitization. I realized with a sick, hollow dread that I was being left in a tomb, and as the lights flickered out, the administrator looked up, her expression finally shifting from composure to raw, primal fear. "They aren't here to save the data," she whispered. "They're here to delete the witnesses." The silence that followed the realization was more terrifying than any siren. As the blast doors groaned shut with the finality of a closing coffin, the massive server racks began to hum with a discordant, rising whine. The administrator didn't even look at me anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the overhead vents, where a thin, colorless gas began to hiss into the room. She knew exactly what it was. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a deep clean, a way for the organization to erase its own tracks by vaporizing every living thing inside the bunker. I looked at the woman with the earpiece, the one who had tried to lead the cleanup crew, and saw her collapse to her knees, clutching her throat. Her weapon clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished concrete toward me. I didn't hesitate. I lunged for it, my fingers brushing the cold, textured grip, just as the administrator turned, her face twisting in a final, desperate act of defiance. She reached for a secondary control panel, clearly intending to override the lockdown and drag us all into the furnace with her. "If I'm not leaving, no one is!" she shrieked, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. I leveled the weapon, not at her, but at the main power coupling that fed the server bank. If I could overload the local circuit, the feedback loop might trigger the blast door's emergency override, a flaw in the design that only an old-fashioned, high-voltage spike could force open. It was a gamble that defied all logic, but my medical training had taught me that in the face of a fatal shock, you sometimes have to shock the heart back into rhythm. I fired. The sparks showered the room like falling stars as the bullet shredded the heavy cabling. The entire bunker lurched. The servers sparked, the screens flashed white, and for a split second, the electromagnetic pulse knocked everything offline. The air scrubbers whined, shifted pitch, and then, with a thunderous bang, the hydraulics of the blast doors gave way. They didn't open all the way, but a gap, barely wide enough for a person to slide through, emerged. I didn't think about the evidence. I didn't think about the politics. I grabbed the drive, which was now pulsing with a steady, permanent green light, and scrambled toward the opening. The gas was making my vision blur, but I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the outside world, of heavy rainfall and the distant hum of city traffic. I squeezed through the gap, my skin scraping against the cold, unyielding steel, and hauled myself out into the dark, rain-drenched alleyway I had been in hours before. I didn't stop running. I pushed through the pain in my lungs, the freezing rain acting like a stimulant, until I reached the main arterial road of the city. I was miles from the hospital, caked in soot and grease, holding a drive that contained the secrets to 1,000 tragedies. I found a public terminal at a transit station and, with trembling fingers, initiated the final command I had seen on the drive's menu. It wasn't just a data dump, it was a global beacon, a dead man's switch that synced the entirety of the organization's logs to the local branch of the Internal Safety Authorities and every major news outlet in the country. The screen flashed. Upload complete. Encryption decrypted. Broadcasting. Within minutes, the city skyline began to change. I watched as police cruisers, unmarked vans, and emergency vehicles from every agency imaginable converged on the hospital district. The sirens created a deafening, discordant harmony that signaled the end of the nightmare. I sat on a bench, exhausted, watching the horizon. The people behind the organized scheme wouldn't just be arrested, the entire structure would be dismantled, piece by piece. Weeks later, the dust had finally settled. The hospital had been shuttered, its board members were in custody, and the witness, the man I had initially tried to help, was safe, currently testifying in a hearing that would reshape the city's ethics for a generation. I was sitting in a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, looking at a newspaper that still hadn't fully captured the scale of the collapse. A man in a plain, inconspicuous coat sat down across from me. He didn't look like an agent or an executive. He looked like a librarian, quiet and unassuming. He placed a thick, sealed envelope on the table. "You've caused quite a lot of paperwork, Doctor," he said, his voice mild and polite. "But you've also saved more people than you'll ever know. The organization is gone, but the world is a lot more dangerous when you hold the keys to the truth." I looked at the envelope, then at him. "Am I in danger?" He offered a small, sad smile. "You saved a patient when everyone told you it was a liability. You stood up to a machine that was designed to make you feel invisible. You aren't in danger, Miller. You're just finally free to be exactly what you started out to be." He stood up and walked away, disappearing into the morning crowd. I opened the envelope. Inside was a fresh, blank medical license, a new identity, and a plane ticket to a city where no one knew my name. I looked at the ticket, then looked back at the city, a place that was finally beginning to breathe again. I wasn't just a doctor anymore, I was a witness to the truth. And for the first time since that rainy Tuesday, I knew that no matter what happened next, I would never again be asked to look the other way. I stood up, left the envelope on the table, and walked toward the station. My life, for the first time, was entirely my own.